Today's lecture is one that I call Peru's King Tut, the Royal Tombs of Sipan. And I think I commented before that when I set up this series of 9 lectures and discussed back and forth with my contact at Regent at Oceana, she said that after we left Jamaica, we had 3 sea days, and she wanted one of those to have something to do with our last port, which was New York City. So the very last lecture will deal with something with regard to New York, but that I could stick in a couple of my Peru lectures for that. So we'll have a lecture on Machu Picchu and a lecture on my 3 favorite sites that you've never heard of. But since we do have today an extra lecture, I had a list of possible extra lectures that I gave to Ray, and so this is not on the original list, but we've put this in because of missing the port in Guatemala. If you're not familiar with where Peru is, this is South America, and the area that I'm going to be talking about is in coastal Peru. So that's the area of coastal Peru. Again, if you're not familiar with the coast of Peru, it is a desert. It's an extension of the Atacama Desert from northern Chile. It gets virtually no rain. This is a little closer view, and I'm going to be talking only about the North Coast region, and that's approximately there. If you have been to Peru but not to the North Coast, Lima is a bit to the south of this, and the largest city in the North Coast is a city called Trujillo, which is right there. It's a city now of over 1 million people. I mentioned that it was a desert. Trujillo gets an average of 1 inch of rain per year. But that's a very misleading statistic. In most years, it gets 0. About once a decade, it gets El Nino rains with perhaps 10 inches. 10 inches 1 year, 0 9 years, averages 1. But it is a very, very dry area. This is a time chart, and on the left are the end dates for various cultures. In the middle is the unit of time that we have broken down Peruvian archaeology, and this is a culture, or this is a time period that we usually refer to as the early intermediate. There are 3 periods in time in Peru when a single culture spread across the Andes. You may be familiar with the last of those, the Incas, and you may be unfamiliar, something that you recognize is that there were 2 previous time periods when a culture like the Incas had spread across the Andes, and in between those 3 time periods are intermediate periods when local cultures were dominant, and this is the earlier of those local time periods. On the north coast, the culture is called the Moche, and that's the culture that we're going to be talking about. I'll start with a brief introduction to them. You may also know them. You may have seen with the name Mochica. That was an earlier name that people gave it. They were the dominant culture in northern coastal Peru from about the time of Christ to somewhere around 650, 700 AD. And a lot of recent research suggests that they started around the city of Trujillo, in the valleys around the city of Trujillo. The coast is a desert, but the mountains to the east, the Andes Mountains, usually receive a fair amount of rain, and so rivers coming out of the mountains to the Pacific provide water for irrigation. So wherever there's a river, there's an irrigated oasis, and it is in these irrigated oases around Trujillo that this culture started. Much of what we know about the Moche, at least in the past, before the recent excavations that I'll be partly talking about today, is from their pottery. And I want to start with 3 names, 3 words that are important here. In Peru, and particularly here on the north coast, we use the term waka to refer to a sacred place. Many times it is a pyramid, but it might also be a cemetery. In some parts of Peru, it would be a mountaintop, it might be a spring, it might be a cave. It's some sort of a special place. We use the term huaco for ceramic pots, and oftentimes ceramic pots are found in huacas. So huacos come from huacas. And the third word is huaquero. Huaquero is a grave robber. Huaqueros find huacos in huacas. Now, it's important to think about the huaqueros. Many of the pots that we're going to be talking about are in museums around the world were found by huaqueros, which means there is no context to them. They're taken out of a grave. What was also in the grave is gone, disappears, and only the stuff that might be marketable in terms of the huaqueros is what gets into the international art market. This guy is important for our story, a man by the name of Rafael Larco Oile. He was born in Peru. His family was Italian. They had come to Peru in the 1880s and had a very large farm, an hacienda, a sugar plantation. As a young man in the time of the First World War, he was sent by his family to Baltimore to go to a boarding school, and then he went to Cornell University. He never got a degree, but he spent several years at Cornell. The idea was that he would be able to bring back modern agricultural techniques to Peru. But he got much more interested in archaeology when he went back to Peru, and he ended up writing 12 books about Peruvian archaeology, several of them about the Moche culture. There's a later picture of him. He died in 1966. I went to Peru for the first time in 1966, but we did not overlap, unfortunately, so I never met him. There's an earlier picture of him out doing archaeology. His family's hacienda had thousands of workers, and he was able to take a few of those workers, divert them from working in the fields, and do archaeology. So instead of being like a huaquero that was simply pulling stuff out of the ground, he was able to note what was in the various tombs and collect a lot of stuff. In Lima, there is a museum called the Larco Museum. It's actually named after his father, not him. But the huacos of the Moche culture, and I'm talking here about the high status, the fancy pots, the ones that might have been used in ceremonials or placed into burials. I'm not talking here about domestic pottery, things for cooking pots and things like that. But the high status stuff, archaeologists suggest that there are perhaps 100,000 Moche pots, the good pots, in museums and private collections around the world. And most of those have come from huaqueros. The Larco Museum in Lima has roughly 40,000. So 40,000 out of the known corpus of Moche pots is in this one museum. And one of the things that's great about this museum, in contrast to most museums around the world, the storerooms are open. You can wander through the storerooms and see the entire collection. That was my goddaughter, Peruvian goddaughter, and I, and you just wander through the storerooms. There's Nadia again. We'll see her in a later talk, I think. But thousands and thousands of Moche pots in this museum. One of the things that Larco did in his excavations, by noting what things were superimposed, that some burials were on top of earlier burials, he was able to develop a seriation or a sequencing of Moche pottery. And we still use what he developed back in the 1920s and 30s as the standard way of talking about Moche pottery. On the upper left there is phase 1. On the upper right is phase 5. Phase 1 is usually cruder. The spout is distinctive. It's what we call a stirrup spout. And the upper part of that spout in phase 1 is usually fairly short and squat. By phase 3 in the middle, the spout, the upper part of the spout, is pretty tall. On the last one, by phase 5, the base of the spout is is wider than the top. It kind of narrows up to the very top of the spout. And phase 5, the stirrup part is lower and usually more angular. So this is a Moche phase 1 pot. The upper part of the spout there is fairly short. Painting on it is not very good. This is also a phase 1 spout. And this would be a phase 3 or phase 4. The upper part of that spout is much taller by this time. Sometimes there's things just painted on the body of the vessel, the globular part of the body of the vessel. Other times, Moche pottery is figurative. So here's a duck, some sort of bird. But if you look at it carefully, this is not just a bird. This bird happens to have arms and hands, and in his hands he holds a shield and a club. Here's one that's clearly just a seabird, and this one a deer. There's another deer, but if you look at this one carefully, it really isn't a deer. It's somebody with a deer headdress. If you look at the body, there's hands. The body is a human hand, a human body. So it's simply a headdress that somebody has put on. Many of them are depicting actual people. This is a little guy. It's a fairly common guy. He's not a high-status guy. We can tell that because his ear ornaments are very plain. He doesn't have any kind of a headdress on, doesn't have any other ornaments on, necklace or anything. This guy also would be fairly low status. And this guy fairly low status. He doesn't have the things that you might find in higher status people. This little warrior guy is a little bit higher status. He has ear ornaments, and he has a headdress on, as well as his club and shield. This guy is very high status. He has a fancy headdress. He has very large ear ornaments. He also has an arete, a nose ornament. And this guy would be high status. Again, he has a fancy headdress and ear spools or ear ornaments, but he's also seated on a throne, and he's got a little pet jaguar, which would have been brought over from the Amazon area, the other side of the Andes. This again is somebody wearing a mask. If you look at the body, it's clearly a human body, but the face is that of an owl. He also has the fancy ear ornaments and the fancy headdress. Now, one of the fanciest and most expensive category of moche pots in terms of the international art market are what are referred to as portrait vessels. And these are actual portraits from life of individuals in the moche culture, usually high status people. This guy has a fancy headdress and he's got some ear ornaments. These are ones that are simply there on the shelves of the Larco Museum. These are mold-made so that there are repeated examples of some people, as many as 10 or 12 pots that are actually identical from the same mold have been found. This one appears to be either sleeping or dead, the way his eyes are closed, but again, fairly high status. He's got fancy ear ornaments. These are just absolutely beautiful pots, and this is roughly a life-size head. The pots, the body of the pot will be something on the order of 9 or 10 inches high, so it's roughly life-size. This is an interesting one. Again, I said that they're mold-made, so you'll have identical pots. Here are two pots that come clearly from the same mold, but they're slightly different in the way that they've been painted and they've been fired and so forth. A number of people have studied the moche culture, written books about it. One of the people that has done perhaps the most is a guy by the name of Christopher Donnan, and this is a book that he did just on the moche portrait vessels. He was able to claim in this book, and I think he's correct, that some of the portraits are of the same individual over their lifetime, that there will be portrait vessels that are clearly of a young adult, and then the same person a little bit later on, and then the person in old age. And we can make that claim because some of them have distinctive tattoos on their face, or distinctive facial scarring, or some other characteristic by which we can clearly identify the same people over a number of years of their life. There's Chris. He started at UCLA in 1969, the spring quarter of 1969, which happened to be my last quarter at UCLA. I had been there for 2 years working on my doctorate, and by the time he came, I had taken a course on Peruvian archaeology at Michigan State University. I had taken it for credit at UCLA. I had taken it for audit at UCLA. And I went to Chris and said, I've already had this class twice here. I can't take it, I can't even get it on my transcript because I already have it for credit and audit, but could I sit in? And I did sit in on his first class at UCLA. We've been good friends ever since. There's the two of us later on. In addition to the portrait vessels, many of the Peru pots, the Moche pots, are simply the globular base is used to paint some sort of a picture. And here, this is a Moche 5 vessel. It's almost Baroque. They're just full of painting. It's just really impossible to almost see what's going on there. It's what we call a fine line painting. There's a fairly simple one. This is a Moche 2 or Moche 3 pot. One of the problems with this is that you're seeing this like you're seeing a globe, only one hemisphere, one half of the pot. You can't see what's going on. So what we have to do is look at a rollout of this. We have to have somebody paint or draw us a picture of the entire thing. So there's the rollout of that particular pot. And what we see is on the other side of that pot, there's a fish, and this is a guy that's fishing. Here's one that on the upper part there's a house, but at the bottom part there's a fine line drawing of something. And when we see the rollout, it's a little house, and there's some people in there, and there's some other objects and so forth. This is a fairly fancy one, and what this one is pairs of guys fighting. And there's the rollout from that particular pot of guys fighting. Chris Donnan identified almost 100 different scenes that are depicted on the Moche fine line drawings, and in some cases, some of the figurative pots also tie into with these particular scenes. The upper one is what we call the burial scene, a rollout done by the late Donna McClellan, and here's one that she did that's called the presentation scene. The way in which we usually talk about these, the analogy that we use to get people thinking about them, is to think of them as Christmas cards. Now, that may sound funny to you, but imagine that you get something in the mail, an envelope in the mail in, say, early December, and you open it up. You probably don't think to yourself, oh, this is a late Halloween card or a late Thanksgiving card. You look at it, and it's got a couple of guys on camels. You know it's a Christmas card. If you are a Christian, you can put that scene of 2 guys or 3 guys on camels into a story that you know. You could have a envelope and open it up, and there is simply a couple of shepherds out in a field. You know how that fits into the story. Or it's a manger scene or whatever. If you get anything as a Christmas card, and presuming it's a religious scene, you can put it into the Christian Christmas story. Our problem here is that we don't know the story. But here's another example of the presentation scene, a different version of what we just saw in the last pot, the last rollout. And in this scene, this is the most complex version of the presentation scene. In the upper part of it, in the upper register, we have 4 individuals. One we can call individual A. He's very high status. He has a fancy headdress. He has fancy ear spools and so forth. He is receiving something. Something is being handed to him by individual B. Behind B is C. C turns out to be a woman, and she participates in here. She hands the cup to B, and B hands it to A in other versions of the scene. And behind C is individual D, who turns out to be a high priest, and he's involved in various aspects of this ceremony. Here's another version of the same scene, this time colored. It's not that we have anything exactly like this, but this is simply an artist's representation of what the scene might be. And again, they run at the upper part there from left to right, A, B, C, and D. In this case, this is an artist's representation. It's not. It's a reproduction. It's not the original one here. But this was a painting on a wall of a waka that was found on a pyramid in the north coast in the early 1950s by an archaeologist from University of Texas. And the figure on the left is individual C, the female who participates in the presentation scene. The rest of the scene, which would have been off on the left on this wall, had disappeared, was gone archaeologically, but we got this one little section of that wall that had individual C. So with that background, I'm going to take you to a place called Sipan. And it's located in an oasis on the north coast, a little bit to the north of Trujillo. About 30 years ago, there were a series of events that took place here, excavations and other things that I'll tell you about, of a high-status Moche tomb that turns out to be individual A. So this is part of the north coast, and Sipan is there where the yellow or where the white arrow is. This is an old map from a book from 1965 book, and Sipan is located there. It's on this map. The kind of shaded areas are the oases, the irrigated agricultural areas, and there is a fairly large city, about 500,000 people, called Chiclayo up here, and Sipan is just a little ways away from Chiclayo. It's about a half-hour drive up the valley from Chiclayo. Here's a little bit lower view, closer view. This is from Google Earth, and the pyramids at Sipan are right there. That little white spot, that's the adobe brick pyramids that make up this site. A little bit closer Google Earth view. There are 3 pyramids, 2 fairly large ones, 1 smaller one that make up the site. And there's an even closer Google Earth image. On the left-hand side, there's kind of a square pyramid. In the center, there's one that almost looks like a pyramid or almost like a cone, a volcanic cone. And on the far right, a much smaller, lower pyramid, third one. This is an aerial view that I took out the window of a small plane we hired to fly over the site. In the background there at the top is the largest of the pyramids, the square one. In the center is the one that's pyramidal or cone-shaped, and at the bottom is the smaller pyramid. What happened here is an interesting story, and how it came about as a story is interesting. Now, vaqueros have been active in this area for hundreds of years, from the early Spanish times. The Spanish actually organized companies and mined some of the pyramids. They sold stock and they reported. We have records as to what they found in some of the pyramids. But vaqueros started excavating this small pyramid, which was the smallest of the 3, sometime in 1986. And by 1987, they found a rich tomb, the vaqueros. And among the things they found were some peanuts. On the right-hand side are the way in which they came out of the ground, on the left after they have been restored. To give you a sense of scale, those 2 upper ones are about 4 inches long. So these are fairly big peanuts. They're not life-size, they're over life-size, and they're made of gold. The vaqueros divvied up the loot that they found among themselves, and one of the guys got these things, the peanuts. Now, in the United States, this is a joke that all you got were peanuts. He did not get his fair share of the loot. According to some people, 6 pickup truck loads of gold were taken out of the looted tomb. Okay? But this one guy only got peanuts, and he did as what anybody would do if you've just been screwed by your friends. He went to the police to report it. Complain that he didn't get his fair share. Now, most of the time in Peru, what would have happened is that the police would have grabbed off what he had, some of his golden peanuts that he was showing them, and maybe gone out and found the other stuff and divvied it up among themselves. But he happened to report this to some honest policemen. and they called in the local archaeologist from this area who happened to be sick that day and didn't want to get out of his sick bed, but he went to see what was there, and he realized that this was one of the greatest tombs that had ever been found by Huaqueros, and here was a chance to see some of the stuff that the Huaqueros had. The police went out and raided the homes of some of the Huaqueros. They recovered some of the stuff. It had already gotten into the international market. It had been smuggled already out of Peru. There's fascinating stories, and books have been written about that looted tomb and the material that got out. But what I'm going to show you here in the next few slides are stuff that came from the looted tomb, some of which has now been returned to Peru, or some of which has been identified by Chris Donnan and others, Interpol and so forth, in the international art market. So here are some of the looted peanuts. The local archaeologist was Walter Alva, and I'd been friends at that point in time with Walter for probably 12 or 13 years, from back in the mid-'70s. And he is still important up here. I think he's an emeritus head of the local museum, but his sons are very active in this area now in archaeology. There's Walter on the right, down in the looted tomb. That's how far down. You can see that ladder in the background there, how far down these looters had gone in this pyramid. And the thing that he's holding there in his hands is something the looters simply had not gotten. They left some stuff down in the looted tomb. That's my picture looking down into the looted tomb. That's how far down they had to go to loot this stuff out. So these are some of the things that they found. This was a little mask. It's about 6 or 7 inches in diameter, gold. Here's a little gold rattle in the outer part of that, the outer part of the circle. Those little balls are about 1 inch in diameter, and they're hollow. They have a little rattle inside, so this thing would have rattled. In the center is a Moche god, Ayapec, the creator god, and he is often depicted with a knife in one hand. In this case, his left hand on the right-hand side of the screen, and in his other hand, in his right hand on the left-hand side, he has a head. He has just chopped off a head. He is the decapitator. There's a close-up view on that same piece. That was about 12 inches across, so what you're seeing here is only about 3 inches high, and that's inlaid shell in the gold for his mouth and his eyes and those spots on his cheeks. This little figure, about 3 inches high. The headdress and the nose ornament and the face mask are of gold. The staff is of gold. The body of this is lapis lazuli. Lapis lazuli comes from northern Chile, more than 1,000 miles away. Here's a little pot that was found in the looted tomb. It's a high-status individual, fancy headdress and nose ornament, ear ornaments, and so forth. Okay. That again is my picture taken out the window of a plane flying over, and the looted tomb was about right there. As soon as Walter Alva realized where this stuff was coming from, he got a group of police to go out. There were hundreds of people here, just local people, looting, trying to grab stuff and so forth. They kicked all those people out, and from then on, for years, there was an armed police guard at the site to keep looters away from this place. There's a National Geographic drawing of it, the big rectangular pyramid on the upper right, the one that's sort of like a cone or pyramid is there in the center. This one that we're talking about now is the lowest of the 3 pyramids, and the looted tomb would have been underneath the stairs leading up to the top of the pyramid. Walter Alva started an excavation in late 1987, and the July, August, September of 1987, on the top of this pyramid. So this is just about when they're getting going on the excavations. This is my photo from 1987, and we're looking at a little room that was partially excavated. In the back wall of that room, on the kind of dead center on the image, is a lot of pottery. This room had contained almost 1,000 Moche pots just scattered in here. Incidentally, when you look at these next series of slides, if it doesn't have a name on it, it's my picture. If it has Chris Donan's name, it's one that he took. If it's got National Geographic, it's one we've grabbed off of National Geographic. I wasn't there all the time during 1987 to 88. Chris wasn't there all the time. We traded slides and images back and forth. So you'll see that I've taken images here from a variety of people to get the entire story. There's the wall of that little room, only partially excavated, and hundreds of pots in this room. There's another view, this one from Chris Donan, looking down on it, and it was just filled with pots. There's some of them as they were restored in the museum. These actually were not very fancy Moche pots, fairly crude. It's as if somebody said to the workers, we need lots of pots, crank them out. We've got a burial coming up on Thursday, and you got to get us lots of pots. And so they cranked these things out. They didn't do a real good job on them, but there were almost 1,000 of them. I was there one day, and they had found something interesting. It was covered over by a tarp, and here it is after we took the tarp off. This was a young adult male burial. He had a shield, a copper shield over his his left chest and left arm. You can just about make out in kind of the upper center of the picture, a green circle. That was the remains of a copper shield. He had a few decorations with him, few copper things. One of the interesting things, he was missing his feet. And when archaeologists talked with the looters, they said, frequently when we find a high-status tomb, we'll find a guardian, and they always are missing their feet, as if they chopped off the feet to keep the guardian in place and not let him run away, as if a dead guardian was going to run away. They continued to excavate down, and down, and down, and down. They eventually hit a fancy tomb. And this is a National Geographic photo when they're hitting the main part of the fancy tomb. This is a reconstruction that's in a museum now. In the center coffin, and it was a wooden coffin, which was extremely unusual. The archaeologists had never seen a wooden coffin before. At best, people would be buried in a cane mat or a cane coffin, but this one was in a wooden coffin. In the center was a high-status male. On his left and right were high-status males. At his head was a female. At his feet was a coffin with two females. The interesting thing about the coffin at his feet was that the females had clearly been dead for a long time before they were buried. They were placed in a coffin, both bodies in a coffin, but when the coffin was lowered into the tomb, it had to be moved in, it wasn't just kept nice and flat and straight. It was tilted at an angle as it was dropped into the tomb. And we know that the people had been dead for a long time because the bones were disarticulated. That is to say, the flesh was off of them, and when it was tilted, they became jumbled. They got all mixed up, but there were two bodies. So there had been the remains of two females at his feet. This is our high-status guy in the main tomb. There's a little bit closer view. His skull is at the very top center. On each side of his skull, there are three of the ear spools, the fancy ear decorations, 3 pairs. You can see the ear spools there by his skull. This is one of the pairs. This is about 4 inches in diameter. Those little balls around the sides are of gold. They are soldered on there. The dating on this particular tomb is somewhere around 400, 450 AD. How did you make those little balls and solder them on? 400, 450 AD. The image there is a duck, and the duck is done with lapis lazuli, again a stone that comes from northern Chile, more than 1,000 miles away. Here's another of the pairs. Again, this is about 4 inches in diameter. The center figure is a high-status Moche male. He has a fancy headdress, ear spools. He has a little nose ornament, an arete. He holds a staff. Around his neck is a chain, a necklace. Those necklaces are on a gold chain, a gold wire. And those necklace around his neck actually is flexible, moves. The staff is removable. Absolutely incredible gold work, 4 inches high, the entire thing, the diameter of the thing. Here's a little bit closer view. Now the ear ornaments have been removed. He has a couple of arrets, the nose ornament, the thing that dangles from the septum of his nose. Got a couple of those there. Inside his mouth, he had a gold piece right over his teeth. The one there at the bottom was over his whole chin, around his lips and so forth. There was something over his nose. There was a gold piece over his eyes. There's what was inside his lips, and there's what was on his nose. This is a National Geographic drawing of the entire tomb, and it had layer after layer of stuff that was his for use in life. Around his neck he had beads. Archaeologists had found beads in many tombs previously, but they'd never been able to see what the bead collars looked like. They had to figure out a way to pull these things out because there were layers of them. And they ultimately put glue on these, then put a piece of cloth on and pulled them out. And they were able to reconstruct what the collars actually looked like. There's one of the reconstructed collars. There's what he might have looked like in life with his bead collar around him. In his hand, one hand, he had a staff with a rattle on the end of it. And it's right there dead center. There's a little bit closer view. Here it is. When Chris Donnan saw this, he said, I know who this guy is. This is Individual A. Individual A in the presentation scene holds this staff. There's give you a sense with the hand there of how big this thing is. So we're now looking at the tomb of Jesus Christ or Charlemagne or some king, an identifiable person. Individual A is this guy. Underneath him, he had this thing. In some of the Moche drawings, we see what they call the back flap, but nobody had ever seen a back flap, didn't know what it was. It is actually, in this case, a rattle up at the top and then a big gold thing that would have gone and protected his backside. There's the same piece after it had been restored. There were other tombs. Adjacent to the tomb, a little bit later, they found a tomb which turned out to be the high priest. Individual B was right next to Individual A. And they found several other tombs. They have now, over the years, found, I think, something like 15 or 16 tombs in this area. They continued excavating over the next couple years. This is by 1989. I'm taking the picture here from on top of the middle pyramid and looking down on the lower one. And they continued to excavate in that area and down and down and down, and ultimately hit another fancy tomb. And this was an interesting one. This one dates much earlier, about 250 AD, so a couple hundred years prior to the one we've just been looking at. But when they began to see what was in here, what they found, and this is the body in the middle, what they found is another Individual A. Turns out Individual A is not Charlemagne or Jesus Christ or some named king, but rather a role that is played in a pageant, in a religious ceremony over the years. So it's more like this is a pope, and the pope has certain accoutrements that are always seen in pictures of him. This high status Individual A is simply this very high status Moche person. Individual A here, what they now call the Old Lord, had some really nice stuff. These were a series of rattles. They're about 5 inches in diameter. They depict a spider on top of a little gold cup. And there's the face of a person, but it's also the body of a spider. It has a series of spider legs. Those little fine gold wires are soldered together. Again, 250 AD, how do you make those fine gold wires? This is about 5.5, 6 inches in diameter. So think of how small those wires are, and how do you even do this gold work? There are a lot of other things in this tomb. I'm going to run very quickly here. The stuff was taken to the local museum that Walter Alva was the head of, with the aid of people from Germany, from Spain, the United States. They were able to analyze and preserve and protect some of the stuff. Some of the technicians from this museum were actually taken to Germany and Spain for training. So they did a wonderful job. And ultimately, in 2005, they inaugurated a new museum to house all the stuff that was found in this tomb. And it is an absolutely wonderful museum. Total world class. If you ever have a chance to go up here, this is an absolutely great museum. Now, in recent years, since Sipan, a number of other sites have been studied. And for example, at one of the sites, they have now found 7 burials of individual C, the female. We have now found at other places the high priest, individual B. And in fact, it's now been determined that back in 1948, some archaeologists found a tomb that was individual B. They just didn't know it at the time. So we have now found at other sites other of the participants in this particular ceremony. So there have been a number of other museums found in recent years. One of them is at a site called the Huaca del Sol, Huaca de la Luna, right outside of Trujillo. And not many of the cruise ships stop at Trujillo, but I know, I think Norwegian does, and Oceania has a cruise coming up next year that I think has a stop in Trujillo. So you could do a cruise that would stop here. This is the new museum there in the center. And there it is, and with closer view. Unfortunately, at the Sipan Museum, the Royal Museum at Sipan, and also this museum, you're not allowed to take any pictures inside. So it would be impossible to show you any pictures, except that the guys that run this museum are people that worked with us all the way back in the 1970s, 76 and 77, when I was running a big project in the Trujillo area. So if you have the guys that run the museum walking around with you, you can take pictures inside. And this is absolutely world class in terms of how things are presented and the information you get and how the cases are set up and so forth. Here's a little video where we can look around it. These are absolutely world class. There are now 5 new world class museums on the North Coast. And I've been working with the Peruvian Prom Peru, the tourist promotion agency in Peru, to try to get more people to not go to Machu Picchu and to go to the North Coast, because it's absolutely spectacular stuff. I'll be up here in August, again, looking at some of this. But it's a wonderful museum, beautifully displayed stuff. You can get your nose right up to some of the cases and see some of this stuff really close up. This is an interesting piece. It was found at the Huaca de la Luna. It's a cloth banner with gold plates and gold things tied onto it, so that if it had waved in the wind, it would have just been spectacular. There's a little bit closer view. This is a little video that's on the wall. I'm taking this off of my video of a flat screen video. That's Ayapec, the Moche god. But here is an image of that same little banner we just saw floating, moving, which you get a sense as to what it might have been if it was hung up and floated in the air. In this part of the animation part of the video, that is an image that is seen on a pot, but they've made it float. So that's that same banner that we just saw. So they found it archaeologically, and then we can see the same thing on the pot. And I'll end here with a little video from a museum in Belgium. There's our typical Moche phase 4, phase 5 pot with some warriors on it. But you don't see this on Moche pots. This is another Moche pot. This one is in a museum, so we actually have the original pot there. But these guys have square shields, and these guys have round shields. They're out in the desert. Notice the cactus and some of the hills in the background. This is typical North Coast desert scene. There's our round shield guys. These are the round shield guys coming in from the right. And the square shields from the left. On one of the pots I showed you earlier, we had pairs of guys fighting. This is a very typical scene in Moche pottery. Two guys fighting. And the square shield guy has just lost. We actually have Moche scenes from walls of pyramids of naked warriors being marched by other guys. This guy has had his arete, his nose ornament, pulled off, so his nose is bleeding. The losers are now naked and are being marched off. And we see this on Moche pots or on the walls of pyramids. Those are vultures at the bottom left. They are seen on many of the Moche pots, participating in some of the rituals. So now the vultures have taken the nude losers. There's our vultures. Again, we actually see this on the pots. And we see what the vultures do. This individual there is cutting the throat of one of the nude losers. That's individual C that is carrying the cup, hands it to individual, she continues here. Here comes individual C on the right. She's going to hand the cup to B, the high priest. And individual B, the high priest, is going to take it and hand it to individual A. I have another version of this lecture that I call Sex and Human Sacrifice. Because one of the scenes in Moche pottery that's fairly typical is our sexual images. but human sacrifice is a very, very common image in this. Neat little video. My next lecture is going to be on Wednesday, but on Tuesday night, after we leave Punta Arenas, we're going to lose an hour. So we keep shifting back and forth. So instead of 10 o'clock, Ray said we could do a 10:30 lecture, give you a little bit of extra time. But I'm also going to have about an hour and a half. Instead of my 45-minute, we're going to get a little bit longer because I'm going to be talking about the Panama Canal. So I'll do the history, the modern operation, and the new version of the canals. We'll catch all of that, but I need a lot longer time to catch all the information there. If you have any questions, I'll be back on the bar there on deck 6. I'm not sure, but I think there's something else coming in here in a few minutes. Thanks a lot.